The three kinds of proofs you can have are a TEE proof, a ZK proof, or an optimistic proof. And the idea is that for maximum security, you should have 2 out of the 3 of these in order to finalize something.
There's certain things that are never going to be possible with ZK and are possible with TEE, such as shared private state.
Today we have with us Orest from T1, and we will be speaking about L2 security and finality based on a post inspired by Vitalik.
From Alysia and Ellie Davidson, welcome to Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into the tech behind Web3's building blocks.
Every episode, we dive into one key question about how crypto works today and the design space for how it might look in the future.
Composable is an espresso pod, a production of Espresso Systems. All opinions expressed by Composable's hosts and podcast guests are solely their own views. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as investment, legal, or technical advice.
So this post Vitalik posted, several weeks ago, and we'll link it for people to look at. But basically in this post, he's talking about how moving forward, we should have this 2 out of 3 proof system where you either have a TEE proof plus a ZK proof or a ZK proof plus an optimistic proof. And we can use this to hopefully get kind of faster finality, but also maintain a lot of security since there's currently bugs in ZK proving mechanisms, et cetera. But I think the really interesting part is diving into these TEE proofs because that's something that's relatively new. And so this is why we have a perfect guest from T1 here. So Orest, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of tell us what T1 is doing and how this all relates to this.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here in this excellent crowd. I'm a computer scientist by trade. I started 2 startups in the past outside of crypto, but I had been involved as a passive crypto observer / user / speculator. I would not call it investor since the early days on because of my interest in free and open source software. So I mean like Mt. Gox, arbitrage days, and then ICOs 3 years ago or 4 years ago, maybe now. And I decided to join crypto professionally, full-time, hands-on as an engineer, and ended up joining Scroll, the ZK rollup, as an early hire on the engineering team there in order to scale Ethereum. That was what we were after back then. And the idea had been, hey, let us use this very cool succinctness property of zero-knowledge proofs, SNARKs, that allows people to verify some compute in a time that's a lot shorter than rerunning the compute. Right? So this would promise the ability for Ethereum to have those compressed execution islands all around it that would then, every now and then, settle back on Ethereum L1, and this way create a scalable system, by which, as computer scientists, we mean a system where, as you add users, you add volume, you add traffic, the costs for running it, or the requirements to be running it, do not grow linearly, but sublinearly. Ideally, not at all, but at least sublinearly. Right? And so at Scroll, we managed to fix part of the problem, as in we managed to get the fees to go down for users who would elect to not run the Uniswap swap on Ethereum L1, but rather on Scroll L2. However, we did not succeed at scaling Ethereum to mean at keeping other desirable properties of Ethereum, the system, intact in spite of growing users, of which composability between those different, say, swapping applications or other dApps is a big one. So what happened is, because of the slow zero-knowledge proof generation times, scrollers and ZK rollups are only able to go back to Ethereum every now and then. And currently we are at around maybe 1 hour of a delay with respect to finality from L1's perspective, which means that you can't have those ambitions that we were dreaming of having the same user experience as on Ethereum L1, where you're able to swap your token in that A and take the result use it to take out a loan on DApp B, and use the resulting outcome again to buy yet another token on DApp C, possibly all within the same L1 block, right? You can't do that because between the steps, assuming that DApp A is on Ethereum, DApp B on Scroll, and DApp C on Optimism, you need to wait for 1 hour or 7 days. And so to fix that, we started T1 early last year. My co-founder John, spelled Khan, and myself, we joined forces. And John specifically had been working in the space as well for a while. He had co-founded Secret Network, the $2 billion L1 using TEEs for confidentiality. And we decided to use TEEs for not confidentiality, but rather integrity, in order to have a system where we are able to real-time prove, like create proofs of integrity of this off-chain component, we call it rollup or L2, in real time, by which we define a bit more to mean in less than 12 seconds.
Perfect. Yeah, no, well, as I was, you were discussing that, I think we've discussed what a TEE is on this podcast before, but maybe it would be a good refresher to have you explain, like, what is a TEE that we keep talking about?
Absolutely. A TEE is what the real OG, the computer science nerd in me, will hate, and everyone hates. But for the moment where the OG and the computer science nerd gets to meet Andrew Miller and gets to have their mind opened again and ask themselves, maybe we don't all need to be the Richard Stallmans of this world and not use HDMI and not give a presentation because HDMI be a proprietary standard, but have a slightly more flexible of an approach. And that's exactly what happened to me a couple of years ago. I met Andrew at the Hacker House, and if Andrew, who I respect a lot, is telling me, hey, have a look at TEEs, there's advantages to using TEEs. They are not the devil incarnated on earth. And I'm saying this is a computer science professor. This meant a lot to me, and I did look at them a bit more. And my definition for what a TEE is and how you can think about it is that it's some sort of a piece of hardware that contains a private key. And it has the following properties. Property number one, getting to this private key is difficult. And assuming the piece of hardware works as intended, neither the vendor of this piece of hardware nor the operator, the person who has full physical access to this piece of hardware, be able to ever read this private key. Property one. Property two, this piece of hardware can run computations and attest to having run a certain code on a certain set of inputs using a key derived from this private key. So what this means in practice is, again, this is under certain assumptions, is that you can have as a user the certainty that some untrusted operator who is running hardware given to them by some untrusted vendor is able to convince you, without having trust between the three of you, is able to convince you that they ran a certain code on certain inputs and got to certain outputs.
Right.
And this could, in particular, the code could in particular be the definition or the implementation of the defined blockchain protocol spec, like Ethereum. The inputs could in particular be a certain snapshot of a peer-to-peer gossiped content of a mempool of such a blockchain network. And the output could in particular be the state resulting from applying some of those mempool transactions on the previous state of the blockchain, right? Just one example. You can think about basically any compute that you could formalize. and that is deterministic. That's a bit of an annoying restriction you would usually be making, because it's going to be very difficult to convince a non-trusted entity about the compute if they are not able to, for instance, have this like backdoor or like this, I guess, assertive backup of downloading the code that the operator is claiming to be running and recomputing on the same inputs, maybe with a TE, maybe without. So a TE is a set of hardware elements that combined give you those two properties. First, there's a private key that's not legible. Second, it's able to run compute and attest to a correct execution using this private key in a way that doesn't require trust in the operator and the guy who actually attaches this piece of hardware to power and to internet and stuff.
Amazing. That's a really good explanation. I especially liked your introduction, and you mentioned the fact that TEs can be used for privacy, but it can also be used for scale. And at T1, you guys are using it for scale. So can you describe more about how TEs help you accomplish that, and even terminologies like remote attestations? Like what exactly is being attested to?
Yes, so what we use TEs for at T1 is mainly the integrity bit. I'm going to make 17 simplification assumptions just because we don't have 17 hours, but half an hour left. And so let's focus on integrity. The way integrity works is you get to have some sort of code that you are running in a deterministic fashion. In our case, it's a TEE optimized modified version of Reth, the Ethereum execution layer client, which basically produces new blocks for a blockchain that we happen to be calling T1, and that also happens to be having this role of being a rollup because an off-chain relayer every now and then takes its most recent state and puts it on L1, and this most recent state has a signature basically stemming from something derived from the TEE private key. Now, this is the general idea. Now, you also mentioned remote attestation. That's I think, widely miscomprehended term, even by insiders in this industry. What we mean technically by remote attestation is merely the process of measuring what this certain TEE that you're interacting with is about, what it's doing, what it's supposed to be computing. And you can think about it in a blockchain rollup context maybe as the remote attestation will be a set of hashes where maybe one hash is the hash of the bytecode of the code that's supposed to be running. Maybe another hash is has to do with measurements of the hardware itself that might, for instance, include like hardware revisions, and you can potentially use it later on if you have several different vendors, several different TEE versions and so on. Maybe some get compromised, maybe you want to deprecate some, etc. And so on. So just think about several different values that don't give you much on their own, but to which you can get if you want to convince yourself and if about what the TEE is doing exactly. And you do it every now and then, usually, maybe even once, and then only do it on demand. Maybe a parallel to think about is SSL and CAs, like certificate authorities. Think about it as, okay, the certificate authority and remote attestation is maybe like issuing an SSL certificate to run your HTTPS website, and this maybe happens once every year or so, unless there's an exploit or like you lost your private key or like someone broke into this piece of hardware upon which you issue maybe a revocation or the thing will have expired, hopefully, etc. And then the other thing that people confuse with remote attestation is just the continuous operation of the TEE, where the TEE produces certain outputs, for instance, and it just signs them with a private key derived from the hardware private key. And that is just, I would again allow myself a simplifying parallel, having an HTTPS server establish a handshake with your client and sign off stuff. Well, maybe it's a bit more convoluted, but this is like the continuous operations thing. People often call this attesting to stuff. I sometimes do it myself, but yeah, technically these are two separate steps. And the first one, the remote attestation one, is very important for, let's say, yeah, blockchain contexts where we care very much about who the TEs, the nodes participating in some sort of network, some sort of consensus, are whether they will be able to convince you that they be trustworthy, even though you don't trust the operator. And the other one, the step of continuous operations, is basically after you've established this trust, which you can maybe envision as some sort of, yeah, having verified the certificate with your CA or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that really helps explain things, because I actually thought the remote attestation is something that happens each time. Like that is part of proving that the processes were correct. So I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, most people think that, and you could be doing it every time, but it's an involved process. It's not as simple as CDSA signature verification or signature and verification, but rather a multi-step process.
Yeah.
So you probably don't want to be doing it on every every drop.
No, yeah, completely agreed. That would be incredibly expensive, I imagine, on the L1 to do. All right, should we dive into like Vitalik's blog post now and kind of discuss it? Okay, so yeah, all right. So on the screen here, and we can link it for anybody who's listening. Vitalik has this blog post, and there's kind of two parts to it that both have to do with proofs. The first part is using kind of a 2 out of 3 proof system. And then the second part is proof aggregation. So first, we'll focus on the kind of this 2 out of 3 proof system. So the 3 kinds of proofs you can have are a TEE proof, a ZK proof, or an optimistic proof. And the idea is that, for maximum security, you should have 2 out of the 3 of these in order to finalize something. So that is different than today. Almost all rollups, except for maybe like Tyco, I think, only have one. So they either have one ZK proof, one optimistic proof, and that's all that's needed to finalize a new state on the chain. But Vitalik is suggesting that we do something a little bit more secure. And the kind of the best scenario is a ZK proof plus a TEE proof. Optimistic proofs take a very long time. Normally 7 days, like Arbitrum's takes 7 days to fully settle. And that's not a very good user experience. So like we were saying earlier, Orest, like you want to be able to settle to the L1 very often. Otherwise, it's really hard to create this kind of seamless cross-chain experience of L2s. And so ZK proofs are still a little bit slow, but I mean, they're on the order of like hours, and they're definitely getting faster. There's a lot of work into making these a lot faster. But TEE proofs can be incredibly fast, like less than a minute or even faster. And so if you have a TEE proof plus a ZK proof, then you can settle to the Ethereum L1 very often, let's say like once an hour. And then as ZK proving time comes down, you can start settling even more and even more. So this is kind of Vitalik's idea. And I guess a couple of other notes, kind of just summarizing his blog post for anybody who didn't read it, is you could say, well, like, what about ZK proofs? Aren't ZK proofs supposed to be like, the absolute best? Like, we should always use ZK proofs. Like, what is the point in using a ZK proof plus an optimistic proof or plus a TEE proof? And I think it's a good point that Vitalik makes, is that our ZK proof systems, in theory, are very, very strong, but they have a lot of bugs. Like overall, they're relatively new in the sense that, they have not been, a lot of the ZK proof systems that we use, have not been around for like 10 plus years. And because there's this propensity for bugs, in these ZK proof systems, like that's a big reason that you want to add an extra proof on it. So you can make sure that both proofs match. So if there was a bug in your proof system, you would catch it. So yeah, that's kind of a summary of what Vitalik was talking about. I don't know, Orest, if maybe you want to comment on the ZK proof versus TEE proof. I think this is a question that people ask a lot, and it's kind of it's difficult to answer because the question is naturally, which one's better? Like a ZK proof is just better than a TEE proof, right? But it's like a lot more nuanced than that. And there's a lot more that goes into it, and each has different assumptions. So I would really say that if we oversimplify things, sure, you could say a ZK proof is more secure than a TEE proof, but I think that really they're kind of like comparing apples to oranges and that they're doing things differently and you have different assumptions. I don't know if you want to kind of comment on like the difference between a TEE proof and a ZK proof, not just in terms of speed, but also in terms of like how secure they are and, these kind of really nuanced questions.
Absolutely, sure. So maybe to set the stage, let us make sure that it's very clear that ZK and TEEs be different. And there's certain things that are never going to be possible with ZK and are possible with TEE, such as shared private state. It's not possible to do it with ZK. You would require additional, even heavier cryptography, such as MPC, FHE, etc., to even hope for that. And these are things that are taken for granted in the real world, outside of the crypto world, where it's obvious that you'd be able to trade in a hidden manner or like have a game where not everyone knows everything, but you can still interact over that shared state that remains secret. So this is one thing. The other thing is they can be synergistic and combinable. You can totally have some system that you are already running and just add extra security via wrapping it into a TE compatible system. You could do the same with ZK, but you probably don't want to. But now, when we think about blockchains, one thing that's, I think, again, this impure approach that the OG in me, that the nerd in me doesn't even want to hear about, like, the theoretical physicists won't like it, is like, hey, let's think about the real life and have a pragmatic approach. And I think maybe it was Ben from Espresso. He recently had this interesting post on this specifically. Hey, let us compare performance and see what this means in the long run. Now, currently, the overhead of ZK over native is maybe 10,000x. So that's 1,000,000%, right? The overhead of TEE over native, from my benchmarks with the most naive, non-optimized hypervisor level TEE TDX is 3%.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we need a slide for this. 1,000,000%, this many zeros,
Yeah.
versus 3%. So
Mhm.
what this means is that 300,000, right? If I'm not mistaken, some zeros here there of a difference. And so what this means is we can already now think and make assumptions as to how fast ZK could be. Some people claim like we could go to as fast as 1K x, 1000x slower than native, so 10 times faster than now. And let us ask ourselves, what does this mean in the real world? Like, let's assume we have native rollups. I think that was Ben's idea back then. And let us ask ourselves, okay, like what does a validator do? Like they could either have someone who they trust to provide them the thumbs up on a certain execute precompile output. With it could be a legal agreement, it could be we are friends, it could be AVS, it could be TE, it could be optimistic, whatever, some sort of slashable thing, or they could pay someone to do the ZKP generation for them, which will be costing like significant premium. And so you can then compare, okay, what's the likelihood that certain validators will be able to find some sort of an off-chain deal or a non-ZKP way of convincing themselves whether a certain execute precompiles output is correct or not. And you can see, well, ZKP doesn't fare that well, even under very optimistic assumptions, right? So this is something to keep in mind when coming from this like ultra pure perspective. And the other thing that I think purists will like, though, is as I think you mentioned already, the age. Like ZKPs have been around for decades, but only have been really like research and in production for the last maybe 3 or 4 years, with like actually a bit more value. But what very few people realize is none of the rollups, none of the ZK rollups have permissionless ZKP generation in a way like end to end, where someone would be able to, if they found a bug, steal money out of the bridge. Like no one does that, because everyone knows ZKP is just way too insecure. And we are years away from formally verifying a first ZKP system. I think Justin Taylor expects this to be at least 2 years away. And there have been like a lot of situations where independent researchers would report like a critical bug being that would enable you to craft a ZKP for some incorrect state transition, and this would be just rarely even noticed by people. So this is something that I think few people realize. I think it's a great vision to have trust in cryptography way more than trust in hardware, or trust in crypto economics, or trust in legal agreements, or trust in this is my friend and I trust him to tell me if this execute thing doesn't check out. But it's far, like we are far away from that. We are early.
I think that was super insightful into understanding just how complicated it is to get ZK proofs to the way that we want it to be, as we understand it in theory, and what is actually happening in practice. And I think that really shares light on Vitalik's post in the fact that why don't we just use one proof system? Why are we combining multiple? And the answer to that is there is no one proof system that is perfect and that we can definitely trust 100%. So when it comes to TEEs, I've heard people talk about TEEs as a semi-trusted proving system. Do you disagree? And what's your opinion there? Like, why can't we only use TEEs to prove?
I think it's a somewhat of an unconventional approach that I have, but my approach with TEs is the biggest weakness is not what some people claim, trust in the vendor. I think that's not like we are small. No one cares about crypto, seriously. And Intel, they have real customers, people with real money, people with real value, not our few $1 trillion. Like, come on, let's be real. Like, and let's quit our bubble, please. And so I don't believe that to be a real risk. And of course, you could argue, well, but if crypto takes over the world, blah blah blah, then this becomes more attractive. Sure, let's have this luxury problem. Then I think there's unfortunately an even bigger weakness in TEs, and that is that the side channel attacks with which you can compromise a lot of the assumptions. Like you can break a lot of the properties. And I think these are the attacks that for some reason people don't talk about that much, and that are very relevant in the crypto context, especially from confidentiality, privacy preserving blockchains, such as Secret Network, by the way, which was multiple times attacked via side channels successfully, including by Andrew Miller, by the way. And so the problem with those is if you are like a North Korean hacker group or whatnot, you have $1 million, you will be able to get some microscopes, and there's actually less extreme measures you could take, and break into a TEE. If your TEE is used to preserve privacy, this means that even if you have a network of them, they will need to have some sort of shared private key for understanding the secrets, the ciphertexts. And so if you break into one, you break into everyone. So that's terrible. We don't want that. That's a big no-go. I think it becomes less of a no-go and actually an attractive trade-off as you approach long-lived ephemeral privacy, such as maybe mempool encryption, where you only care about a certain piece of data staying confidential for a couple of seconds, and then you're fine because it's published anyway as part of the block, maybe, etc. So there is use cases where confidentiality with TEEs makes sense, in my opinion, but not secret network style large like set of node confidentiality use cases for long-lived privacy. I think that's not a good use of TEEs. Now, what you could also envision happening, and what has happened in the past, is the side channel attacks, by which we mean the ability to control areas that are outside of the TEE. So it could be physical access, such as playing with voltage, measuring the flow of electrons, like that. Your data is there somewhere in like plain text. Like there's some bits that are ones and zeros somewhere, right? The same for the key. The key lives somewhere in plain text. There's some ideas around like actually physically unique, like non-clonable, non-observable functions. But as far as I know, they are quite far out still. So generally, you have this like secret somewhere in plain text. So it is fundamentally possible to get to it. The question is how difficult, and the answer is $1 million is enough. And with that, like let's say you get to attest, like I'm using attest in a slang way. Let's get the CE to sign off on some compute that produces a state root that is to your liking and not the correct one. Then you are able to steal all money from the bridge, for instance, in case of something like T1 or like a rollup. So we don't want that.
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that something, or at least I sometimes see people, I guess, a little bit confused about is, you mentioned that TEEs maybe aren't so good for privacy reasons. And well, like blockchain's all public, so like, why do you need privacy? But you do still need privacy for this key that is like signing everything in the TEE. So these attacks like are still applicable to TEEs that are just being used for integrity and not privacy.
No, luckily not. It's luckily
no,
not
I'm
that
wrong.
bad.
Okay, go ahead.
So by privacy, I mean having shared private state. It's easy to have non-shared private states, such as a local private key for a given key. That's fine, and that doesn't have this like terrible effect that if you break into 1 out of 1 million TEs, you've broken all of them. No. So what you can do for integrity is you have your private key in a TE. The TE wants to join the network, and then there's some sort of remote attestation and some requirements for that. And then what you can do to prevent any sort of integrity violations in a more general case, and what we are building at T1 also, is to not only then have a single TE propose a new state that goes to the canonical bridge on Ethereum, but rather you require deterministic state replication among several TEs, maybe all of them, depending on your set. So like a big portion. And under this threat model, are you immune against attackers who are able to corrupt the TE up to your consensus threshold? So in practice, up to a third of people who manage to break into their own TE and then also make it sign off on something fraudulent is the threshold up until which you are secure. So it's way, way, way easier to have an integrity short network than a confidentiality one, because you can't make that happen with a privacy preserving network.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Well, this is
Also, just to be a bit more nuanced, when I
Yeah.
say, hey, you can peek into the TEE and like steal privacy, it's not as easy. Like, it's not that you, like, as far as I know, there have actually not been successful attempts at breaking into the actual private key that lives in the hardware of, say, Intel SGX, which is also the backbone of Intel TDX. But rather it's like further down or like up in the pipeline, like in the okay,
Yeah.
maybe there's like a memory pattern and you can create. So one interesting example is you have a JPEG stored in a TEE, and that JPEG is acted upon. There's some convolutional neural network processing it, and you can, from the host operating system, you control the memory. So in particular, are you able to create page faults? Like you control whether a page gets evicted or not out of the real memory, like real, it's all virtual, right? But out of, let's say, one level higher in the reality pyramid, and then the SGX will have your operating system fetch a memory from somewhere. It's in ciphertext, so that should be fine. But it turns out, because of the manipulation running in a TEE, the pattern with which you are fetching those pages will be as visible as the traditional tax image, like some computer science nerds might remember in Wikipedia. If you go to, I think it's AES counter mode CTR, you have this image of a tax, and then you apply this naive, like naive version of AES symmetric cipher, and you literally with your naked eye can see that it's a penguin. It's just like grayscale. So the same thing happens if you have like edges versus gradients versus like plain color pixels in an image that is being processed by a CNN in an SGX system. So it's more like this level of like highly crafted attacks rather than the attacker, like the North Korean guy, getting into the hardware and getting the private key out and thus being able to sign off on anything.
Yeah. No, yeah, this is really good. I didn't know that. And I mean, I guess this podcast is kind of turning into like just a TEE podcast, but I actually think that that's great because I'm learning a lot and I think that it's good. All right, so TEEs, there's only a handful of vendors that make these TEEs, and one of the arguments that people make is, like maybe that's centralizing, or rather, if let's say we have a network of TEEs, but they're all running Intel SGX, and then Intel SGX somehow gets compromised, well, then we can compromise like the entire network of TEEs. But on the other hand, the other argument is that the vendors of these TEEs like do take it extremely like seriously, and the operators of these TEEs as well. So like if AWS is operating your TEE, I don't know what they call it, but it's like they call it like yeah. Mhm. And so maybe like this attack, or maybe this vendor attack, like you said earlier, isn't as big of a deal. But anyway, I'd be curious to hear your opinions on like, does it matter that there's really only a handful of vendors? Does it matter like in T1? Is it all like Intel TDX that are run, or do you have like a variation of, do you also run like AWS Nitro or anything like that?
Yeah. So maybe one again anecdote is the reason why TEs are trendy. It's not because there's T1 or because there's Bitcoin. No one cares about these small guys. It's because there's data centers, and because big corporations have CEOs, and CEOs have a check mark: is my data encrypted? And they want to tick it. And so, as far as I know, this is the driving force behind TEs, especially in cloud scenarios. And what this means is there's a big incentive for vendors to craft this like special hardware for cloud operators, where the cloud operator can make this like political claim: hey, we don't have the ability to look into your data. I think this is where this whole thing is coming from. However, for a blockchain system, this is terrible. Like, we don't want to only allow proof of cloud certified nodes to join our network. Like, this is basically the opposite of what we aspire to as a decentralized system project. And this has very practical consequences as well. Like, there have been numerous incidents when AWS zone goes down, or GCP or whatnot, and then your 7 out of 10 websites you visit don't work for an hour. Like, this actually happens. And this is this very like special property and unique feature set that blockchains like Ethereum promise their users, that this not happen. That even if there were a third world war, hopefully not, but likely yes, and then the network would withstand. It's actually super interesting to like look into like the third world war resistance property of Ethereum if you're interested.
I feel like that should be a whole
one.
podcast.
It would be great to have multiple vendors. It would be amazing to not only have proof of cloud vendors, but any, and ideally to have quotas that a certain maybe quorum of SGXs, quorum TDXs, quorum of AMDs and so on sign off on something. But the reality is it's very far away from that. We are very far away from that as an industry. And there's barely a standardization effort going on even to use multiple TEs. So I'm afraid it's far away, but there is some very cool projects such as Autonomous TE who are working on even making a fully open source hardware TE and who do a lot on the reproducible builds front, which is basically getting in like a non-trusting user to be convinced that a certain hash in a remote attestation claiming to pertain to some sort of code of some blockchain node actually does what it claims to be doing. Like, that's a highly non-trivial task.
Yeah.
That's the one we are only using TDX for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I mean, honestly, I feel like we could also do a second episode where we continue to dive into TEEs, because like there's a lot like there's definitely very tangible differences between SGX and TDX, which, if people don't know, they're different kinds of TEEs that Intel makes. And I don't know, TE is like such a rabbit hole to go down. I think there's so much more we could talk about here. I have like a list of kind of like questions I've been thinking about for some like future episode.
Amazing. And then like if we bring it back to Vitalik's post and something that John posted about T1 and the way that you guys use TEs, which I thought was interesting, is the fact that you are using a TE or a network of TEs to verify your state, but then you also have a ZK proof that sort of acts like a stopgap. So you combine TEs with crypto economic security. I know you plan to use AVSs as well for that. And then you have this periodic ZKP. So could you like highlight or touch more, explain how that periodic ZKP works and what it aims to achieve?
Sure. So maybe to take a step back, what Vitalik is talking about is not increasing finality for ZKP rollups. It's increasing finality, like speeding up finality for optimistic rollups and increasing security for ZK rollups, right? What we care about, our hypothesis, is that a 1 hour finality delay unbearable, that users need the ability to interact and compose across chains with lower latency. And also another non-obvious thesis that we are making is people do not need synchrony in composability. It's not necessary to be able to do everything at once, but it is necessary to be able to do things with delays that are shorter than 1 hour. Like, we are thinking 12 seconds is a good number, because that happens to be the current block time of Ethereum L1. And how we kind of implement a tangent on Vitalik's vision is we do not, under normal operation, require ZKPs. We only require a TEE proof, so like a trivial ECDSA signature, basically from a previously remotely attested TEE. And this would give you, let's say, security of maybe 1 million or something like in that range. We don't want to only be able to bound to having 1 million TVL in the bridge. So in order to open up more security, we require that multiple TEEs reach consensus on the deterministic block production. And in order not to have to bootstrap our own validator set with a significant stake, because this only makes sense if you have a sufficiently higher stake or reputation, right? We use restaking. So we use an AVS for this. And then the security becomes the restaked stake, right? So maybe you can attract $1 billion in restaked stake. Now, what happens if your TVL approaches that security bound? Well, it would become more and more attractive for an attacker who will have managed at 1 million cost maybe to have broken into the TEEs and who has staked sufficiently highly in the AVS to break protocol rules and steal the money from the bridge, because the stake would be slashed, but they would still be net positive, right? So in order to avoid that ceiling, it is that we employ ZKPs. And the fashion in which we employ them and how we very much try to avoid this Vitalik-induced TE plus ZKP 1 hour finality delay is by not requiring ZKPs on the regular operation, but by keeping track of the value at risk since the last ZKP checkpoint, and incentivizing more and more aggressively the creation of what we call periodic ZKP. And if we ever see such a periodic ZKP being provided, and this would be rewarded with some portion of the protocol fees, reflected also in the gas pricing policy on DL2, then we would be able to verify it. And if it checks out, then maybe we have some multi-proof or whatever as well, if in doubt. But if it checks out, we would then be able to set our value at risk counter to 0 again. So we will never have had to pause finalization. There's never a 1 hour delay, but we are able to every now and then go back to 0 with the value at risk. And now there's this extreme situation, which unfortunately you as a crypto builder have to be building for. This is what you care about, not the happy path. And that is the market moves. Some crazy president gets elected or whatnot. Unfortunately, these things happen. And so what you want then is the ability to withstand a situation where all of a sudden transactions come in that would exceed the security budget, say in one block. And so what we do then is we would only then hold finalization and require a ZKP to be provided before finalization can resume.
That is very clever. And what I love about this, and I love the fact that you distinguish the fact that Vitalik is currently talking about optimistic chains who currently have 7-day finality. We want to make them faster, but we do appreciate that ZK proofs are not perfect. They take some hours. And then we do appreciate that TEs as well as something that people are still trying to wrap their minds around. So we're combining these proofs together to be able to make optimistic systems fast. And where T1 is different and unique is that they never started as an optimistic system. They started using TEs, they're using cryptographic security, and then using ZK proofs plus some clever accounting of risk to determine when they want to, in their version of running a fraud proof, kind of like how optimistic systems run a fraud proof. So I think that's really clever. And I would love to see how you guys continue to mature. And I think that makes me think about this idea of a dynamic fast finality. So with Ethereum, you know for sure, okay, 1 block every 12 seconds. But in these cases,
you don't.
Well, true.
There could be a missed slot. Also, finality is 12.8 minutes under normal conditions and up to infinity.
Right. That's true.
There's no upper bound.
That's true. That's true. I guess we colloquially expected. We colloquially even just trust when we see the transaction first showing up on Etherscan, but that's not actually when you can say the transaction is final. So when dealing with T1, you would have like this lower bound, which is when the TE proofs have confirmed, which you guys are aiming for 12 seconds. And then ever so often, there'll just be a few hours up. Let's just make sure everything checks out so we can keep things secure.
Exactly.
Very cool.
All right, should we wrap up? I think this was like a very enlightening episode. I think I guess we can all share our opinions of like what do we think of TEEs or whatever before we end. And maybe another good thing is to say like if there's one thing that we want people to take away from this conversation about TEEs, what would that be? And so, I am definitely like not a TEE expert myself, but I actually like did work with TEEs at my previous job. It was not crypto related, and I think that they are really cool. And this isn't crypto related, but I think a lot of times TEEs they can be very secure. But one thing that people forget is like if there's bugs in the code that your TEE is running, that can also completely break your security guarantees. And I mean, that's true with all code, but I think it's kind of something like we assume like, oh, whatever's running in the TEE is accurate, but you need to make sure it's actually like the code is actually doing what you expect. But yeah, overall, I feel very excited for TEEs to kind of speed up finality and like speed up, like bridging transactions and cross-chain transactions so they can be more user-friendly. I think that, it's a very important piece of like making interop very fast. I don't know, Alysia, what do you think?
I think for me, I wish ZK proofs were faster. Like, I really love the concept of ZK proofs. I love the idea of using cryptography to secure things and also scale things. And when it comes to TEEs, like, I'm still honestly wrapping my mind around it and understanding the risk model. I think when you get involved in the blockchain space, like, you learn a lot about different risk models, but it's not very clear how to quantify it and how to compare it. Like, even if you understand the technical components of a TEE versus a ZK proof, you may not truly understand like where does the risk aggregate and when should I be afraid. So I think for me, it's like I just wish there was an easy way to quantify risk for all of these systems depending on the implementation. I think it's just kind of getting trickier to understand, can I get my funds or not? And I really appreciate platforms like L2Beat for trying to categorize this, and that's the best thing we have. So I am looking forward to seeing how T1 accomplishes this TE crypto economic model. I think that's super interesting because at the end of the day, we need fast transactions. Like, I love these conversations about deep tech, but I'm always thinking like, as a developer, am I going to build an app that people use? As a user, would I want to use this app? So I think because TEs sound like it gets us there soonest, I am 100% on board because we're still trying to scale Ethereum.
All right. What about you, Orest? What is like thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
I'm thrilled to see that people are becoming less and less religious about being like, okay, this is good, this is bad. And I think we need a lot more transparency, a lot more education, a lot more understanding for where the trade-offs lie. Like I think Alysia you just mentioned, in order to just make the best decisions and enable the user to make the best decisions. And ideally, of course, we would abstract these complexities away from the user and build systems that are able to support them. And I think we are in those super early days of crypto where it's still uncommon. Like even the Bybit hack shows us like we still use the same security for whether we transfer a single dollar or $1 billion worth of value. Like that's crazy, and it's just not realistic to expect users to be going to L2Beat and checking the slices every time they have the intention of doing some sort of thing on chain. Let us abstract these away. Let us create systems that support the user. And I think TEs are a great element, a great mix in this set of multi-dimensional trade-off soups that we are cooking. What were you working on with respect to TEs outside of crypto? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I was on I was using AWS Nitro. It was for like basically like secure or So part of it was it implemented like a mutual TLS kind of
Mm.
paradigm. And the reason it was in a TEE was because AWS did not support mutual TLS otherwise. So like we had to have a secure way to do it. And then the other kind of TEE stuff was for, um, it was kind of like experimental for just like, oh, like you want to do this compute. To be honest, it didn't really need a TEE. Like it was kind of like, oh, let's use a TEE because it
Mm.
sounds good, to be quite frank. Yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And this is where I kind of got the thing was like they threw the TEE in because they're like, oh, let's use it. And I
Yep.
think part of this TEE was it was going to use this key, not the TEE's keys, but this like other key to sign these messages. And I was
Mm.
like, yeah, that's great. But also you're storing that key like not securely. So the TEE is not really helping here. But
Mm.
that was kind of like lost on
Yeah.
like, what was happening was like, yeah, the TEE will attest to this, but that doesn't actually mean anything if like it's
Yeah.
not doing what you want. Anyway, yeah, I thought it was really fun.
Yeah, that's a big open item that no one understands. Like, how do you even security harden something that's running in TDX? Like, that's a
Mm.
critical issue with TDX, right?
Yeah.
And no one talks about these things. I think there's a lot of PR going on and little nuance and
Mm.
little substance. And I think that would ideally change, at least in the technical circles.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining this episode of Composable. I hope that you learned a lot more about TEEs and, can kind of parse all of this TEE discussion that's happening on crypto Twitter all of the time. And we really appreciate Orest from T1 joining, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks
Bye.
for watching.
Yeah, thank you
Bye.
so much for having us.
Hey, this is Ellie and Alysia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Composable. We love hearing from you, so please hit us up on Twitter at ComposablePod. Send us feedback and join the conversation.
Our episodes go live every 2 weeks at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss an update. And you can even enjoy with your morning coffee. Share it with your friends and fellow builders.
We'll see you next time on Composable.